nationalism in its current state is antithetical to the goals and visions of democracy. Oftentimes, when we think of the nation, we only think of those who are in the majority population and fail to give the rights and representation of those who belong in minority groups. For example, in the US, we fail to understand the sufferings of the Black community at the hands of police brutality and imprisonment. Similarly, in Pakistan, when we only think of rules and laws according to Islamic principles, we fail to give due rights to those who belong to minority groups who do not follow that religion. Ultimately, we must hold our leaders accountable who follow a majority mob mentality and give due rights to those minority groups who provide such richness to our societies.
Nationalism as it should be, not what it's become, is essential for a healthy democracy. The problem with nationalism isn't what it's meant to be or to do, but it's what it's become. See, conceptually, nationalism should work. It is essential for a healthy democracy, because in order to build a country or a society, we need people to come together. And the concept of home and improving one's home is what brings people together. For instance, when building a country, for example, America, if we want this country to grow, we need people, all American people, Black, Asian, Native Americans, Hispanic, white people, to come together and contribute towards the economy, build the infrastructure, and be politically active. In a country where every single person is working towards the betterment of a country is when a country can truly grow. Not to push their own political agenda or their own personal agendas, but being nationalistic means, as it should be, to work and push for changes for the betterment of all members in the nation.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are. I'm Stephen Erlanger with the New York Times, one of the sponsors of this wonderful forum. My only regret is not to be with you in Athens, which is one of my favorite places. But we have an extremely good panel for you. We don't have tons of time. We only have about 40 minutes. So I'd like to get right to it. With me, virtually, we have Elhadj Assi, who's chairman of the Kofi Annan Foundation and former Secretary General of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, groups that do wonderful work, in my view, and we should all give them money, too. We have in Athens my wonderful former colleague, Alison Smale, who covered the 1989 revolutions, who was a UN Undersecretary General. And we have Andreas Bummel, who's Executive Director of Democracy Without Borders. So our topic is the strong and the weak. Nationalism and democracy, are they contradictory? We can get into that. But first, my thought is to just ask you, given what's happened since, did we misunderstand what happened in 1989? Was it a victory of liberal democracy, or was it something else? Was it something that was more about the resurgence of identity or the resurgence of, let's say the word, nationalism or patriotism? So that's really my first question, and I thought I would just start off by asking Alison, who was covering '89, what she thinks. Alison, off you go. Off you go.
Thank you so much. It is wonderful to join everybody in this part live, part virtual discussion, which I'm sure is going to be a way forward for the future for us all to maintain communication in the strange circumstances imposed on us by COVID. But certainly there could have been no thought of COVID on that joyous night in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell, and I was there and came through Checkpoint Charlie with the first East German to cross. I will never view the joy of that evening as a mistake, but it definitely serves as a reminder that we must always work hard if we want to produce good results. And there's a great deal of talk about togetherness now, a great deal of talk about the need to work to preserve democracy. And it sounds slightly sort of schoolmarmish to do this, but it definitely is something that takes a lot of work, and we can only really work against those who say they are strong but are in fact perhaps weak. And we can reinforce those who appear weak so that they stay strong. And I think very much of President Trump and Vice President Joe Biden last night. I don't know how many people really stayed up throughout the night in Europe to watch it, but it's very, very clear that this is a contest about strength and weakness of certain kinds. And if there is a strong, dare I say, moral belief in togetherness, then we have to be sure in not only being together, but being there to help the weakest people.
Great, thank you very much. I'll just turn now to your colleague sitting next to you, Andreas, and wonder what your first thoughts are on this topic.
Well, my first thought is actually that 1989 symbolizes indeed a victory of freedom and emancipatory values. And I would say that these values and this will for freedom is still in existence. Nevertheless, we have a trend of authoritarianism in the world. We need to take note that across countries everywhere, there are strong protests against authoritarianism. And concerning the topic of this panel, I would say in a healthy society, the strong need to embrace the weak, just as has been said a moment ago. And this needs to apply to the global scale as well. So I would say that if we look at the motto of this Athens Democracy Forum this year, Reimagining Democracy, there is a lost opportunity after 1989, insofar as that did not happen. Democracy was not reimagined, and that's something we need to do now as global problems are becoming more and more virulent in a literal way and urgent. We need to reimagine the scale at which democracy operates, and that scale, the right scale, to match global problems, that's the global scale.
Great, thank you. Now I'd like to turn to Mr. Assi and just ask you, I mean, does the West overinvest in the idea of democracy? Some argue, let's say, that there's a kind of authoritarian capability that sometimes works best in the developing world, in a world of problems. You've been involved in some of the world's darkest, most difficult places. What do you think, sir?
I think that democracy and the situations that we experience in different parts of the world remind us of what really it is about. And speaking from Athens in a democratic forum, it's sometimes important to go back to the roots, which is about people. Democracy is not only about a system. It is not only about an ideology. It's not about the West or East or the North and South. It's about people. It's about people's life. It's about people's well-being. It's about people's aspiration. And you can see throughout the globe, regardless of which states of economic development people are, they all aspire for something that all human beings have in common, which is their human dignity. So if democracy, can deliver on the human dignity, if democracy, can deliver towards the aspiration of people, if democracy can be a safe space where people's voices count and people themselves also count, it is a universal ideal to which I would say that everybody, will be aspiring to. So the different forms now in which those systems are being translated into governments, into systems, into bureaucracies, or you name it. This is what sometimes question the ability to deliver to people, and then question sometimes the legitimacy as well as the credibility it carries. Even in the United Nations, where we all carry on, where we all gather, we often forget that it's not about we the governments, it is not about we the states, it's about we the people. So in the worst humanitarian settings that I used to work with, in the poorest part of the world, the poorest of the poor want the best for himself, herself, for their children, and they aspire to their dignity. And that is, I think, what we then become. And the failure to deliver on that will be questioning pretty much the credibility as well as the legitimacy of the democracy, even though I would say that it is a universal ideal, towards which most people are aspiring to.
Yes, of course, no system's perfect, and democracy has its problems. I mean, I keep thinking, we often think of the Americans and the British as having, very well developed democracies, and yet inequality has been growing enormously between rich and poor. There are big issues about race and ethnicity and cultural identity, but just in terms of delivering equality, delivering equality of opportunities, is democracy falling down, do you think? And I'll start again with Alison, who's British born.
Though I have not lived there for many years. And it's interesting that both the United States and the still United Kingdom are going through phases where their leaders are coming under criticism, particularly from outside their two countries. I think that democracy is a sort of living process. You have to work at it. So nothing that is said now needs necessarily to be cast in stone. But the signs that there are people in power who would like to prevail by force rather than by debate and hard work, those are unmistakable. And it's definitely a worrying time for both places. However, it's also not exclusive to the United States and the United Kingdom. We see the rise of strong leaders in a lot of places. I hope that goes some way to addressing your question.
Yes, very, very much so. Andreas, I mean, you're trying democracy without borders, but I mean, is it a harder sell these days?
No, quite the contrary. I believe there is a growing recognition of the fact that global collaboration is necessary, and not even only necessary, but actually not enough, that next steps are necessary for democratic institutions to actually being able to deliver, because I guess that's at the key here. People that, that is confirmed by surveys carried out globally, people, they are not dissatisfied with democracy as a principle of government. What they are dissatisfied is the performance of actual democratic governments. That's the point. And so we need to ask ourselves, why are they not able to deliver the outcomes that are expected? And I think that has a lot to do with globalizing forces, influences from the global scale, deregulated markets and such, that actually undermine the ability of established democratic institutions to deliver and to actually be relevant. So that's why people recognize this more and more, that what is needed is more participation and better representation at the global scale. And that's exactly what's been said about we the peoples, giving we the peoples a voice at the UN. Because if we look at how the international system is run you would have to acknowledge it's completely undemocratic if it comes to the representation and participation of the citizens on the ground. Because the UN, by definition, is an intergovernmental organization of member states, and who is represented at the UN, and not only the UN, but all fora? That's the executive branch of governments. So that's by definition, only a small share of the populations worldwide, if you look at it from a cosmopolitan perspective. And
Sure.
The big problems.
Sure. I mean, one accepts this point, but of course, these people are elected in representative democracies. So, I mean, it's very hard to come up with, though you may tell us that there's a better way of doing it, but at the moment, it's not like all of these people are unrepresentative. And anyway, it's an interesting debate, which is what we really want to have here. Asi, do you agree that globalization has undermined the attractiveness or the efficiency of the way democracy works?
Well, there is a paradox in this question because, in an ideal situation, globalization, should have been a fertile ground, for democracy worldwide. But I think, in addition to what colleagues have said, what really matters, in this day and age and in this global world, in this globalized world, in a democratic perspective, is the importance of leadership. A leadership that cares, leadership that delivers, leadership that cares really about what people do care about. And I think that's the breakdown there that we're experiencing. And it questions, the accountability and the transparency that is required for people to adhere, to the overall democratic principles, that we're seeing. And then, as you mentioned before, the kind of inequities, that we also see, the gaps and disparities of all kinds between rich and poor, among minority groups, between men and women, in all these settings, is also a failure of delivering, for people. And that is really what is questioning, the democracy in the eyes, of those who are looking for a system that is responding to their needs, more than anything else. And I think that where we have to, put more emphasis on that the alternatives might not be better. The democratic systems are still, the ones, that we need to work on and try to continuously work on it to preserve the gains that are made and then build on those gains and continue to strive for excellence. But in a globalized world, in a digital world, if this is not happening, other avenues, will be explored, and then citizens in their own rights, rightly or wrongly, will find also other ways, and those other ways may become big challenges, like we see the internationalization of fragilities and the internationalization of terror and all those kind of ways of expression, which is not what we would like to see.
I mean, one of the things that I'd like to get to is there is a kind of competition going on. It's not perhaps the best kind of competition, but between the people who call themselves authoritarian democracies or illiberal democracies and the more traditional kind. And I'm not just thinking here of Hungary, for instance, or even Poland, but China, which is very clearly not a democracy, which has strict control, even more now than before, from the Chinese Communist Party, which isn't very communist, but certainly knows how to control things. But it has delivered such enormous growth to the weak, and it has delivered so much economic benefit to its population, and quite a lot of pride, that I wonder, Andreas, why don't we start with you, whether you find this problematic for the kind of Western democracy that we're used to thinking about, or is it overdone, overemphasized? What do you think, Andreas?
Well, first of all, it is certainly good that millions of people have been shifted out of extreme poverty, but at what price? That's something we need to ask. And also, China has also been delivering concentration camps where millions of people are held under inhumane conditions in an illegal way that is in contradiction to international law. So China, in effect, is a brutal dictatorship, and that is something that has been overlooked for too long. I mean, 1989 was not only the fall of the wall, but it was also Tiananmen Square. So I think we are at a point where we need to recognize really who we are dealing with. And the reality that there has been, it seems, some economic benefits from China's policies does not brush away the fact that this is a country that is violating human rights in the grossest terms.
Covered the liberation, let's call it that, of a whole block of Eastern Europe, which I knew very well also, from what we considered to be a kind of authoritarian control. We saw it as a liberation, as the opening of a democratic system. But many people, I think, in these countries now think we misinterpreted it, that actually what it was a chance for them to become sovereign again and to define their nationalism as they pleased, not in our terms, but in their terms. And I wonder whether you agree with that. And if so, does that explain or help explain why countries like Hungary and Poland have seemed to have turned away from the kind of democracy pushed by Brussels?
Was the question to me?
Yes, please.
Okay. It wasn't clear this end because we had a slight gap in the sound. I mean, I think that what we saw in Eastern Europe at the same time as being viewed as a liberation, it was also a liberation to look back at the history of that particular country or the region. And whereas we had a famously titled thing, The Death of History, in fact, I think it was more like the rebirth of history. And what we also often forget in looking at Eastern Europe is that while countries like Czech Republic and Slovakia formed out of Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, other places, we also had the gathering terror and enmity in the former Yugoslavia. And that led to war in Europe. This war was most famously symbolized by the siege of Sarajevo, a city which had been host to the 1984 Winter Olympics, was very heavily destroyed in what is a medieval form of warfare, which is a siege, and starving people. I mean, they weren't starving, but they definitely had to scrounge for food. We had to mount this colossal United Nations effort for conditions to be maintained just stable enough that when everybody finally realized they'd have to come to the table and negotiate, they did do that. But I cannot tell you the number of times I've listened to Western politicians wax eloquent about 70 years of peace on our continent and seemingly totally forget this open wound that was Yugoslavia, and which still today is not really healed, and I think is one example of how, yes, you need togetherness and you need a sense of liberation for democracy to work, but you do have to, I'm sorry to sound like this school teacher, you have to work at it all the time, otherwise it goes missing. It's like the child pupil that you thought you had and you discovered they've run outside and played truant, to continue the teacher metaphor.
Exactly.
Does that make
Mr.
sense?
Well, it does make sense. I still think it is really interesting the way Hungary and Poland define their identities now in freedom as something less than the democracy people want for them. They define rule of law differently. And this is one of the challenges, it seems to me. I mean, those were weak countries, perhaps, who became strong and exercised their strength differently. Mr. Assi, I wanted to ask you, in the last 4 years, President Trump has defined American interests differently. He's turned away from multilateralism. He's not interested in democracy promotion in the world. Basically, he said to China, to Russia, you do whatever you want at home. I don't care, just as long as we're clear about our own interests. And I wondered, in the developing world, sir, whether you thought the loss of America as a kind of symbol, perhaps, or has it lost value as a symbol for liberal democracy and for a kind of democratic generosity? Or do people think that this is just temporary?
Well, first of all, I don't think that there is a unified view of the developing world, towards America. It has been always a varying view, and pro, against, critical, and everything in between. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think a country, like the United States of America, is more than a president, of the country. There are also institutions, that work. There's a private sector that is vibrant. There are thinkers, philosophers, and people from the academic world that continue to engage also worldwide. I think there is definitely, as far as I can say, in all those countries, no matter which one you mention, and I don't want to fall into, this kind of a divide, China here, US there, Hungary, and then Poland, and I don't know, Brazil, and so on. But I think in all those countries, there is something about leadership that has to be looked at, and leadership that is trusted or not, leadership that is accountable and transparent or not, a leadership that is using, populist means, in order to have some short-term gains, and then the systems that are embedded in the society and how people interact, with each other. Of course, having said that, that will have an impact somehow on the, multilateral system, which of course is not in its best time right now. And here again, it's about leadership. There were times, when we had, crises that were much more severe than the ones that we experienced in today, and leaders stood up and take decision. And leaders stood up and show solidarity. Leaders stood up and saw that, we are one humanity, when we are one planet, and we have to make our contribution to make it work. Today, we are seeing a kind of a withdrawal within the national boundaries, and that is critical because there is nothing wrong for a government, to care for its people. Who will be against that? But it should never be to the detriment of the common good and the common values we have. And I think that's really where leadership matters. And we are crying for that leadership right now, worldwide. And we are missing some of them that are no longer with us today.
I take your points, all of them, very, very well. I mean, it's one of the things that struck me is how generally populist leaders have not handled the COVID pandemic very well. It's really interesting. I mean, you think they could control their systems and it would be fine. China, again, is a little hard to read because they're throwing journalists out every day. So it's hard to know exactly what's happening there. But the kind of control they've exercised over people who might be infected is not something that works very well in Western societies. One of the things I wanted to just ask you, the students in the beginning of our debate, we're making a distinction between nationalism and the protection of minorities. And I wanted to see whether any of you thought this was valid. To me, nationalists, people tend to use it as a slur word. We're patriots and you are somehow nationalists, right? So what we believe in is great, but what you believe in somehow isn't. So Andreas, I wanted to ask you, do you see this as a contradiction, or is it a false understanding of what nationalism is or could be or should be? I mean, does it somehow not protect minorities? Does it have to stand for majority identity? That's what puzzled me.
Well, I think that actually both students that we heard made valid and completely right observations. I think the question is really what kind of nationalism we are talking about. Is it an inclusive nationalism that embraces minorities and that embraces multiculturalism? Because the fact is, most nation states on this planet, they are diverse and multicultural. So if nationalism embraces this diversity, I would say it's very healthy. It can bring people together of a diverse kind and help, establish a society that has solidarity across boundaries of all sorts. And what we are seeing, however, is the development of some extremist majoritarian nationalism, which I would say is extremely unhealthy. And that's not the kind of nationalism that is constructive. And I don't want to identify certain countries here, but that is a big problem. But otherwise, if we are speaking of inclusive nationalism, I would say that's absolutely compatible, with different layers of identity that exist. A national identity, certainly for nobody, is an exclusive identity. There are lots of layers, which includes, for many people, surveys confirm that, also recognition of a global identity as a global citizen.
Yes, which is something that interests you quite a lot. I wanted to ask Alison also, if I may, whether somehow Europe seems to be learning how to embrace a nationalism that is inclusive. It hadn't always been. Europe had a lot of actually pretty mono-ethnic countries. It's a post-colonial phenomenon. And I wondered whether you think it's doing a good job in creating this idea of an inclusive nationalism, or whether it still has a long way to go.
I think the answer tends to vary with the collapse or success of the latest initiative in Brussels to take care of all sorts of matters in a more pan-continental kind of way. I think that fundamentally, Europe is still a continent made up of nation states. And the nation state concept, which we can date variously back to 17th, 18th centuries, is something that still seems to give comfort to people who cheer for their national soccer team, for instance, and don't think, oh, we're all engaged in a marvelous sort of love fest here on the soccer pitch. They get quite fiercely nationalistic, if you like, about it. And I think we therefore have to ask ourselves, have we got the form of governance and sort of loyalty to a nation state that is suited to the 21st century, where technology alone drives us to act at a much faster pace? And I think also that faster pace is what is making it hard for anybody to sort of master both nationalism and togetherness at the same time. It's a lot to demand of individuals. They need to be rallied around a certain cause in the way that, let's say, Václav Havel was able to rally the Czechs and the Slovaks as it happened. And then, guess what? Their state broke apart. But in fact, people were worried about that. In fact, it has worked reasonably well. I mean, there's pockets of discontent. But it's not something that started a fresh conflict across the continent.
No, that's good.
And so,
I mean, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. It's just that we've got only about 8 minutes left, and I wanted to get a couple questions from the audience in, if I may. We have one from a member of our executive committee, Metropolitan Seraphim Kikotis, if I'm pronouncing it properly. And I wonder whether, Mr. C, you might want to respond to this. He says that the late Kofi Annan, Secretary General, someone that we spoke about before, proposed the reconstruction of the United Nations to protect all of humanity better for all crises. That's his question. And he wonders whether there's been much progress made on that aspiration.
I'm sad to say that, well, maybe little progress has been made, but not enough. Had we embarked, on the path that late Kofi Annan has already so designed in his words, in his deeds, in his engagement, in his daily fight. I think and then many other people join in that movement, and leaders support and participated actively. We would have been today, in a place that is very different, from where we are. And that is linked to what we've been just discussing before in the question you posed. How can we trust any system or any government or any leader to protect the majority if they cannot even protect the minority? I mean, so simple. It is the lack of credibility there and a lack of legitimacy if a minority can be protected. How can I trust you that you can now protect the majority? What we call nationalism, we also hide behind nationalism in many things. For example, today we're in the middle of a COVID crisis, and people are talking about vaccine nationalism and therapeutic nationalism. Frankly, there is nothing nationalistic about that. It is simple egoism instead of having, the solidarity that is required, forgetting one thing, that in a pandemic, and that is really reminding us also the political systems and democracy, in the pandemic, none of us is safe until we all are. And also for peace and stability in the world and the well-being in the humanity, unless we're all at a certain level of dignity, a certain level of aspirations, that are responded to, none of us will be safe. And none of us also will be in a place we would like to be. So I think we should get out of hiding behind the slogans of nationalism and alike, and do the needful, deliver for people, solidarity, partnership, care, support, and that's what we need.
That's very nicely said. Andreas, you have been talking about a kind of parliament, a sort of global parliament. Would you like to just describe briefly what you have in mind and whether this would fit the spirit of what Kofi Annan was talking about?
Yes, a global parliament is actually not a new idea. It's been around for a very long time. It had supporters like Václav Havel, for instance, who's been mentioned today. And the idea is really that the world citizens would be democratically represented in a way that would include minorities worldwide. And there are different forms how this can happen. But the long-term goal is actually that there would be global direct elections of representatives to a body that complements today's intergovernmental organs at the UN. So we need to be aware, the UN, as I said before, that's only the governments. And if we want to give we the peoples a voice, that is, possible if we establish a parliamentary body. And parliaments are recognized as unavoidable, elements of good governance everywhere. So the question is, why do we not accept this very same principle at the global scale where it is so important?
Alison, if I can come to you, you've just been working at a very high level at the United Nations. We've only got 3 minutes or so left, but what lessons did you take for democracy and this idea of a kind of global commons? What did you find workable and unworkable in what you just experienced?
Workable was, for instance, to get right behind a campaign that became pretty pronounced under Antonio Guterres, the current Secretary General, of concern about global warming. I mean, this was really an emphasis that he put, and I think it was an issue that he saw that he could tackle, whilst perhaps more themes that might have been termed more ideologically confrontational wouldn't have worked so well. And he also put a great deal of emphasis on trying to get more young people involved. And we've heard throughout our discussions of the Athens Democracy Forum so far of this being needed. It seems logical, and it's relatively easy to start. When the difficulty comes when people are already inside the UN and in the structures, and then they want you to tell them what to do. And we're looking actually at the young people to tell us what to do, beyond clear out of seats of power and cede it to them. So I think the things that are achievable are relatively undisputed steps like that. But as ever, the difficulty is taking it to the next stage. And how does that happen? Clear.
No, that's great. I mean, and certainly I'm glad you brought up the whole notion of climate change, because, you know, there would be a lot of so-called weak in the world who are going to drown unless the strong in the world work a little more quickly to stop carbon from flowing outward. We are, unfortunately, I wish we had more time. I've really enjoyed this myself. I hope it hasn't been too painful for anyone watching. But I do want to thank Alison, Smale, my former colleague, Andreas, Bummel, and Elhadj for their very wonderful participation, and wish you all very good luck, safety, health, happiness, and more democracy all around. Thanks to you all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.